Hello, welcome back to the channel. This is EMP CycleWorks, and today we are assembling a ZX14 Kawasaki with plus 2mm bore, giving us a displacement of 1,510 cc's. Let's get to it. This bore is already cleaned, so what I'm doing is basically just double checking and make sure there's no dirt or anything from the machining process inside the bores. Everything's been measured and spec'd out. If you want to see that process, make sure you check out video number 1 in this series, which I'll link down in the bottom of the description. And then it's time to put some engine oil on the cylinder bores. And this is just conventional 10W40 that I'm going to use to break in the motor. And just make sure you get a good coating on the inside of the bores. I'll do this on the inside as well, or underneath. And then we install our bearings that have been measured, and you want to make sure they are dry when you install them. We don't want any oil on the back side of the bearing or where the bearing goes in the block, and this can cause the bearing to deflect, which will decrease your amount of clearance. And everything's set perfectly here, so we need to make sure they're dry when we install them. And just make sure they're sitting flush to the block. Install our piston oilers with a little bit of thread locker on the bolt, and don't forget to include the sealing washer. And then these get torqued to 18 foot-pounds. Flip the case over, and it's time to install the pistons. So start by assembly lubing the piston pin, the small end of the rods, and then the pin bosses in the piston. Then we assemble the piston onto the rod. I like to do the rod first because it makes getting the piston pin clip in a lot easier. Kind of gives it a backstop. So you push it in and then use a 90-degree pick and the indent in the piston to help me push the clip into the groove that the clip goes in. And you got to make sure that it goes in completely all the way around. You do not want the clip to come out. Very important that you take your time here. I mean, this whole process, you have to be real thorough and careful about everything you do, but this especially. And once it's in, you double check, make sure the rod's not binding at all. Now, same thing with these bearings. They have to go in dry. You don't want any oil on the back side of them especially. And then just snap them in and make sure they are flush to the surface of the big end of the rod. And then we put in our piston ring, starting with the oil expansion ring first, the lower oil ring, and then the upper oil ring. And whenever you buy pistons, they'll come with a chart on how they want these oriented. It's pretty much, 90 degrees from each other in a certain pattern, and then the oil scraper ring and the compression ring are 180 from each other. Here goes the oil ring, the last oil ring installed. And then we got to figure out which one is the compression ring and which one is the oil scraper ring. And the oil scraper ring usually has a chamfer on the bottom, or a notch cut in it on the bottom side of the ring, which aids in scraping the oil off the cylinder wall so it does not get into the combustion chamber. And these CP pistons, there's a dot on the top, and plus the compression and the oil ring are different thicknesses. If you have one wrong, the other one's not going to win. And then the compression ring, there's usually a dot. If not, there's a taper on the inside of it to push the ring out into the cylinder wall as the compression forces act upon it. Now we use our automotive style ring compressor to install these pistons and get the rings into the bore. And you just lightly tap it in until it goes down. Simple. And then make sure you clean off, you know, the ring compressor has to be really clean before you install. You don't want any contaminants on the bores and the pistons as well. And here's assembly lube on the bearings. And when I installed these pistons, some of them I pushed down too far, or I had them clocked the wrong way, and I damaged the oil or the piston oilers. So I'll show you that in a second here. The crank gets assembly lube, and then you install the crank very carefully. You don't want to nick any of the journals or anything here. And you can see those first two piston oilers are bent up, and that's because the piston was clocked a little bit when I pushed them in. So I had to get new ones of those, which held up this process. And I don't think I realized it until I had this crank installed. Now we just push up two of the pistons into the journals on the crank. Lube up our end caps, making sure they go on the same way, and make sure they're for the same rod. And I'm reusing the stock rods. They're good to about 300 horsepower. So and you get new bolts and new nuts when you do that. So I'm using the rotation angle method to torque down these rod bolts, and they get torqued to 28 foot-pounds. Of course, there's lube on the bolt and the nut. I'm going to clean them off and mark where the corner of one nut points at the rod. I'm going to make a mark on the corner and then on the rod, and I'm going to turn these because they have to be turned 120 degrees. So there's 6 flats on each one of these bolts, so that just means I got to go to the past one corner to the next corner, and then it'll give me the 120 degrees of rotation here. And it's important because these bolts stretch, so you want to get the exact amount of stretch that the bolts are called for. So we get the torque right, and the main issue is the bearing has to be round. So exact torque here is important, so the bearing stays round. One thing I didn't show is a thrust washer. You can see it on the table here. I definitely installed those before this motor went together, and you just slide them in right between the middle crank bearing. Now we install the balancer deletes, making sure to oil them up decently, and then oil the seal, which is a brand new seal, and install it. And don't forget the pin that holds it in place. And I want to wipe off any excess oil that's on the shaft. I don't want it to interfere with the sealing surface of the crankcase here, which has to be completely dry and clean. Now we need to get our transmission in, and this also has a locking pin for the bearing, and then there's a half moon shaped clip that also goes in the transmission when there's a recess in the bearing that accommodates that. And on that bearing there's a hole where that dowel pin goes, and very, very important that the dowel pin gets indexed into the transmission bearing properly. If not, you're going to destroy these cases. Sure, the race should not spin when it's installed properly, and it should pop down into place. And I'm going to use assembly lube on the gears just to make sure everything's lubed for when we start it up. And then make sure you get your dowel pins into the engine case, the lower half here, or the upper half I should say. And we'll locate everything and to make sure everything's aligned. And then setting up the lower case here is the same. Install the bearings, make sure they're completely dry. And then we got to install our bearings in the case for the transmission. And basically just tap them in once you get them in there nice and straight. Make sure the bearing is smooth. It's having to be ceramic bearings. Glue Loctite on the retaining bolts, and then install the retaining plate and the retaining bolt. And then these bolts get torqued to 89 inch-pounds. Then we lube up the bearing with some engine oil just to aid in installation into the transmission cap here. And it's installed the same way as in the case. Just make sure it's nice and square, and then you just tap it in with the proper bearing press, or bearing tool, you want to press on the outer edge, the outer race. You don't want to press on the inside. Once it's nice and straight, it'll just pop right in. Just make sure it's fully seated. And it spins nicely. Install it onto the end of the transmission shaft with the new O-ring. And I usually put grease on that O-ring just to make sure it's sealed. Just to aid in sealing, a little bit of insurance. And then it only indexes one way, so make sure you get the bolt holes lined up. Blue Loctite on the fasteners. And then we get the bolts installed, and you want to go slowly here. They have a shoulder on them to locate the drive shaft cover there, and then they get torqued to 18 foot-pounds. Same thing, lube up the transmission, just make sure everything's nice and greased for initial startup. And then we're going to partially install our shifter drum here. And I'm going to start the shift rods. And index the rear, or the upper shift fork, or that's the lower shift fork. And it's easiest to get it all indexed properly in the transmission if you go through end of the shift drum, if you go through the bottom. I left in here how I struggle with it a little bit, just to kind of show you. It's not all super easy like all the editing makes this look. But once you get it in, and once everything's lined up properly, the shift fork shaft will go in easily. And the upper shift forks don't index into this transmission, so you just index their pins into the shift drum, into the proper groove, and just let them hang in there, because they're going to index into the transmission in the upper crankcase half when we glue this thing together. And blue Loctite on the retainer bolt for the retains the shift drum and those two shift shafts. And those bolts also get 89 inch-pounds. Now for the detent spring, we got the spring, the bolt, the detent itself, and a little spacer. And it gets blue Loctite. Once it's indexed properly, and you got to be careful because you can damage it if it's not in right, it gets torqued to 106 inch-pounds. And then we're going to install our shifter shaft, indexing it onto the shift drum, and then the washer and snap ring goes on. And now I'm just going to set the lower case onto the transmission, so I can double check, verify that the transmission is assembled properly and everything shifts. So here I am spinning the input shaft and going through the gears. Again, I do this just to double check before I glue everything together. Now to glue the cases together, so I'm going to use a little bit of brake clean on my microfiber rag and clean off the sealing surface. And then when we go to install this, we're going to use 3-bond 1211 as the gasket material here. This stuff's great for sealing. It's not stringy like some of the other stuff that's recommended. The problem is it's white. I mean, a lot of cases are black, so you just have to do a little bit more cleanup. But you put a really thin coat of sealant where the service manual tells you. It's pretty important that you don't want to get this stuff, because it's going to squeeze out a little bit. You don't want to squeeze into any bearings, so you put a thin coat on the lower crankcase half, and on this surface here it's pretty much just do the whole thing. When you start to get to the next surface, I'm going to show you there's a channel that's grooved into the case right here, and you don't want to go past that because there's an oil channel right behind it, and that groove is there to catch any of the gasket material that squeezes out. So it'll squeeze into that channel and not into the oil passage. And then there's the same thing by the main bearings too. So you go up to that channel. You don't want to have anything in there. You don't want to really thick around that area too. These cases are machined very, very accurately, so you don't need a whole lot of gasket sealant material here. Just a nice light thin coat. I can't stress that enough. And make sure you follow the service manual on exactly where this stuff goes. And here I'm just getting out a little bit that I got onto that groove, so I don't have any issues. If that oil channel gets blocked, then you're going to have a short-lived motor. So assembly lube on the bearings, making sure they're nice and lubed up. And then I'm going to hit the transmission one more time. Probably overkill. That Maxima assembly lube that I use is really sticky, so it stays put. That's kind of what I like it. And it also smells like cinnamon, which is kind of weird. But so once everything's set up and we double check everything in the service manual that we have to install, we install the bottom case onto the top gently. We want to make sure our shift forks get installed properly into the transmission. And once that's done, we lube up the bolts and the washers and get the main bearing bolts installed, as well as the bottom 6mm bolts that go along with sealing up the case. Once we get all of our main bolts installed, we'll do the outer case bolts for the lower case. And then there's 3 bolts that go inside the oil pan here that we're also going to install. And they're 3 different sizes, so make sure you get the right size bolt in the right hole. They should all protrude out when you just drop them in the same amount. That's how I can tell if the bolt's right or wrong. If it's too long, it can crack into an oil passage or just crack the case and destroy the case. Bolts installed, and the bolts on the outside get Loctite, blue Loctite, and the ones on the inside as well get blue Loctite, but not the main bolts. The main bolts get oil or moly lube. And then I'm going to run the main bolts in by hand in the torque sequence. They're numbered, so it's really easy to follow. And then they get torqued to 36 foot-pounds, so I'm just going to touch them with my wrench. And then just go a little bit more with the torque wrench. The service manual doesn't give you, a different torques. It's just 36 foot-pounds, but I like to sneak up on it. So I'm not torquing down one bolt too much, and warping or disturbing anything. Here we go to our, I think this is 20 foot-pounds that I'm doing here in the sequence. And then I dial it up to a final torque at 36. And if you look, you can kind of see that there's a bolt. There's 2 bolts you could see that are 10 millimeter topped bolts. I think they're 6mm threads. And then there's one on the other side where the clutch goes. Don't forget about those, super important. And if you notice, I'm in my garage here. This has been an ongoing process. First, this transmission actually that I have here it didn't work. It's a transmission for an older bike, and everything looks the same, but there's a couple millimeter difference, and it didn't end up shifting. So the last shot where I showed you how I checked the transmission, that's with the new transmission that we got from R&D, which was back cut, polished, and coated with ceramic bearings, so it's pretty much the works. It should be a really great bike. And then all these get 106 inch-pounds. And basically I just double check and make sure I got all of them, especially the ones on the inside of the case. You don't want those coming out. Alright, now time to get the head installed. So I have ARP head studs on this, which require the ARP bolts with the washers, and then I get the Ultra Torque ARP lube, and I lubed up all the studs. I'm actually got these bolts from 8 Performance, so I'm pretty sure they're ARP, but they're branded with their brand name. Head gaskets on, and then the head goes on, and then we install all the washers. And you see my hands are dirty. That's that ARP Ultra Torque. It's like black grease. It makes a mess of everything, but it's what they call for. And then I use the socket, which is a 13 millimeter 12 point, to install the nuts. And then these are torqued to 55 foot-pounds, so I go, in 3 steps. I usually do like 20, 35, and then 55 foot-pounds in the sequence. The sequence that's shown here. And then we get our valve shims installed with the valve buckets. And I'm going to use assembly lube on the side of them. We have a webcam, and webcams wants their assembly lubes on the cams, so I'm going to put that on the cams and on the top of the buckets, but assembly lube, my normal assembly lube, just on the sides. Everything's smoothly operating when we first start it up. And just make sure the shim is completely in the little relief of the valve. Here is our new cam chain being installed. Grabbed it out of the box, nice and smooth, not kinked at all. And here's what the old one looks like, nice and kinked. Don't want to run that will be noisy. Although I didn't hear any noise when this thing first came in. But lube up the new chain. I use assembly lube just to, like I say, make sure everything's nice and lube when we first turned it on. Lube up the sprocket gears on the cams. Then lube up the journal surfaces on the head. Lube up the bottom sprocket. And then we're going to install the chain. So fish the chain down, pull it out a little bit at the bottom. You'd like to start the sprocket at the bottom because it's indexed. It only goes on one way. And once you get it started, you pull it out a little bit, you get the chain installed, and then put the chain on. And now you don't want the chain to kink and fall back in, so I use something heavy just to hold it. Nothing too crazy heavy, but my little T-handle wrench works very well for this. The front guide goes in with assembly lube on it. Or that's the rear guide, excuse me. And that's held in place by a pin that goes through the case, and that's retained by the cover. So once everything's lined up, I put the pin in, Sometimes easier said than done. Then the front guide gets assembly lube, and this is held in by a bolt down behind, or down in front of the cam sprocket, or the sprocket that's on the crank, I mean. Blue Loctite on that bolt. Blue Loctite on that bolt, and it gets 89 inch-pounds. And when you put blue Loctite on stuff, you don't want to go super crazy, just a drop, which is all you need for it to be secure. You don't want a blue Loctite to leak out and get in the engine anywhere. Not good for bearings and whatnot. Now we'll time the crank. There's a line and a 1 and a 4, and you want to line that up with the seam of the crankcase. And here's the webcam's cam lube they want, so I put that on the journals, or the cam lobes, I mean. Yeah, it's real thick stuff, so it's kind of a pain. But you get it on, and then I'm going to assembly lube on the bearing journals. The rear, I usually put the rear on first, seems to go on but easier. And make sure you line up your timing marks. Now these are APE adjustable cam sprockets, so they have pretty much the factory timing marks. On the rear, on the exhaust there's 3 dots, on the front there's 1. And I have these things degreed so where they line right up to there, which is pretty nice. Makes assembly really easy. If you use the factory sprockets, then you have to like engrave them to make sure you have a reference when you go to install them. Then use blue Loctite on all the bolts, making sure you get the dowels in there for these cam caps. The dowels will make sure your bearing surfaces are round. If you don't have them in there, they can be offset and you can eat into the head. So I go really slowly here, a little at a time to push these cams down, and while I'm holding pressure down in the middle of the chain in between the 2 sprockets, because as you're doing this, the cams can rotate and it can throw it out of time. The chain will pop off a tooth, and as the cam wants to try to spin as you're tightening these down. And it's very, very tedious process to get these things installed. Say slowly but surely, and then all goes down smoothly. And I'm just going to speed it up because it gets ridiculous. You don't really want to use the power tools here to install these, because the camshaft can end up breaking if you torque down too much on one side. Or you can damage the caps too and the head. I mean, there's lots of things that can go wrong. And these bolts get torqued to 106 inch-pounds. And I usually go over each one of them just to double check and make sure I get them right, because I try to go in the proper sequence. And once they're torqued, we're going to get the tensioner installed. This is an APE manual tensioner. So it's basically have it completely loose, install the tensioner, line up the installation bolt holes, use blue Loctite on those bolts, tighten them down, and then you can see the chain wants to pop off there a little bit. So I'm torquing these to 106 inch-pounds while holding the chain there, and then I'm going to put my wrench on the crankshaft sprocket, holding down the chain, and this will load it up and get it to where it won't pop off anymore. So the timing marks are going to be off at this point. So I'm going to run in the manual tensioner just until it touches. You don't want to go too tight. Turn the crank over. Turn the crank over and verify timing here. So I'm going to turn it over until the 1 and 4 are aligned with the crank seam here. and my dots are lined up on the cam. So this crank is going to spin twice for every rotation, one rotation of the cam. So the 1 and 4 can be marked and the cams can be 180 degrees out. So just want to make sure both those line up. Tighten up the manual tensioner by hand just until